Hi, everyone. My name is Nicole Kelly-Westman, and I'll begin today just by doing a land acknowledgement for three separate places that we're all joining each other from today in this World Wide Web moment. 2218 is based on the unceded and unsurrendered territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. The organization is made of individuals that are respectful but uninvited guests. Some of us were born here, some of us come from lands of tall prairie grasses, some of us from opposing shorelines, and some of us from far off distances. As a collective of individuals, we work collaboratively to forge new paths and look back to ensure those carrying along with us have the means to navigate at their own paces. Constantly, we look with deep inspiration to the rhizomatic work of Hao Shui, new growth, to slow ourselves to a pacing resemblant of trust building as we continue to recognize the potentials within interconnectedness. This is a place where salty waves meet the shore, where the red cedars and Douglas firs are so thick you need many arms to embrace them, where the boulders and pebbles remind us of the mountains they broke away from, where the rivers have currents that oscillate in both directions, where the buds turn to blossoms and saturated gradients, where the clouds hang low and make the softest light, where the snow only kisses the highest peaks, where the sunsets have exquisite seasons, where the leaves intertwine as canopies. We commit ourselves as individuals within an organization to reconceive definitions of labor, to remind ourselves of the ones who tended to this place before us and who continue to care for it now, to be diligent in the ways we tenderly hold space for those to come, for those to rise up, for those fatigued, and for those determined by the rigor of resistance and the softness of resilience. We welcome with us today Rosemary Heather, who is joining us from Takaranto, a land that is the traditional territory of the Huron-Wendat, Houdanese, and Anishinaabe peoples, including the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. This territory is under the One Dish, One Spoon Wampum Belt, a peace treaty held or shared between the Houdanese and Anishinaabe people to share land and resources. Takaranto is a place where fresh water meets a sprawling shoreline, a place where the surrounding watersheds make themselves felt in the perspiration that melds with humidity, in the sweetness of thick summer air, or in the bite of cold whipped about in an icy winter wind, a place where there are exaggerated, beautiful conclusions of each season and with creeks that meander through the thickets of woods. We are also lucky to share company with Svitlana, who's joining us today from Kamian. It's Polinsky. I so apologize. And this is just a tiny, brief acknowledgement of this area. She's joining us from an area that pulls its sustenance from the Stomrick River and is recognized for its many valleys. I'm sure she has a lot of other more beautiful things to say about it, but I've never been there before. So with that recognition of the many places we're coming from, I'd like to pass the metaphorical mic to Jesse. So thank you.
Great. Hi, everyone. Thank you, Nicole, for your territorial acknowledgement and bringing all of our geographies together with some prose and poetry. My name is Jesse McKee, and I'm the head of strategy at 221A. I lead the organization's research, programming, communications, and advancement. And I do have to apologize if there's a bit of background noise. Please to just let me know, because as soon as I sat down, they started digging into the asphalt outside of my apartment, and we have single pane windows here on the West Coast, so it's a bit noisy. So I'll try to speak up, and apologies if it's too loud for whatever you're listening on. So thanks for joining us for your start to a short week here in Canada. We're just back to work from a long weekend. And today on the West Coast, we're eager to hear the state of the COVID infections and if we'll be able to travel within the province again. So there have been restrictions here in place since March, and today was their deadline. But we're gathered here so that we may present to you the launch of 221A's digital strategy titled Blockchains and Cultural Padlocks. We've just completed our research phase of the initiative and have published a research report of our findings, values, and recommendations. We convened a research cluster to investigate the potential of blockchain as an institutional technology, and through this collective work, a freely available 200-page PDF was produced. It includes research papers that survey our culture's ability to enable a mass collaborative financial turn, developed with new models for digital cooperativism. The emergent strategy is to enable the conditions for recommoning land, data, and objects through the development of responsive and resilient asset sharing, power distributing, and value generating networks. We're supported by the Canada Council for the Arts Digital Strategy Fund, which awarded a multi-year grant to 221A and their organizational transformation stream of its awards. This program, from 2016 to 21, supported strategic initiatives that will help artists, groups, and organizations better understand the digital world, engage with it, and respond to the cultural and social changes it produces. Today, I'm joined by the Digital Strategy Initiative's Editorial Director, Rosemary Heather, as well as Svitlana Matviyenko of Simon Fraser University's Digital Democracies Institute. Rosemary has been working with 221A since 2019 in developing this project, and also authored a research paper titled The Staking Internet in the publication, which she will tell us more about later. Whereas Svitlana is a relatively new reader of the publication who brings some questions and conversation that will connect our research to broader narratives she's investigating at the Digital Democracies Institute. This group of diverse scholars and stakeholders from around the world collaborate across disciplines, schools, industries, and public sectors to research and create vibrant democratic technologies and cultures. Please allow me to formally introduce our speakers today. Rosemary is an art journalist, curator, and researcher with a specialization in blockchain. She writes about art, the moving image, and digital culture for numerous publications, artist monographs, and related projects internationally. Her recent interviews include Naufus Ramirez Figuera, Anna Kachayan, Chris Kraus, Kent Monkman, Ursula Johnson, Ken Lum, Carrie Tribe, and Hito Steiler, to name a few. From 2003 to 2009, Rosemary was the editor of C Magazine in Toronto, and since 2015, she has helped and worked in the blockchain industry as a writer and researcher. Her clients have included Wellpath.me, BitBlocks Technologies Incorporated, Pegasus, FinTech, Block Geeks, Bitcoin Magazine, and Decentral. An archive of her writing can be found at rosemheather.com. Svitlana Matviyenko is an assistant professor of critical media analysis in the School of Communications and associate director of the Digital Democracies Institute at Simon Fraser University. Her research and teaching are focused on information and cyber war, political economy of information, media and environment, and critical infrastructure studies. She writes about practices of resistance and mobilization, digital militarism, dis and misinformation, internet history, cybernetics, psychoanalysis, posthumanism, the Soviet and the post-Soviet technopolitics, and nuclear cultures, including the Chernobyl zone of exclusion. She's a co-author of Cyber War and Revolution, Digital Subterfuge and Global Capitalism, published by the University of Minnesota Press in 2019. About the flow of the events today, we're working with Rosemary Heather and Svitlana Matviyenko, and they'll speak after me. So I'll speak for about 20 minutes or so to give you an overview of our strategy and our publication, its contributors and main messages. Then Rosemary will follow up with a view into her paper, The Staking Internet. That'll be about 10 minutes. Then we'll be joined by Svitlana for some questions and discussion, which include you. So please use the chat and Q&A window to get involved in the discussion. When we come to question time, you have the option to write your questions or join us with a live voice. If this is your first time at a 221A event, I hope you find it engaging, challenging, and a space to ask hard questions and think about big ideas. You can sign up for our newsletter to receive invitations to our future programs, learn more about our services. I'll paste a link in the chat for you to sign up. Let me just transfer over here to my slide deck. Please bear with me. Okay. So As I mentioned, this is our digital strategy research report. This is the conclusion of a first phase of a multi-phase project. So we're really just leaving the research part. We've done our reading, we've had our conversations, we've consulted with the folks that we want to work with and the communities that we want to engage. And so these are some of our ideas that we've come out of that period. And we're looking ahead to a period of development. And then after that, we'll be looking at a period of implementation. So today, I'm just going to talk about the kind of high-level messages in terms of the strategy, give you an idea of who participated, who contributed work to the publication, and then what to look forward to as part of our event series, which is part of this research launch. So for those of you who are new to 221A, we're a nonprofit organization. We were initiated as a student club at Emily Carr University in 2005, and then we were founded as a nonprofit in 2007. Our mission is to work with artists and designers to research and develop social, cultural, and ecological infrastructure. And we do that through a number of ways, through research initiatives, through our research initiatives, as well as our research fellowships. We have several fellows working with us this year. And we also work with artists on long-term operation of infrastructure, like at the House Shui, the New Growth, which is a garden that we operate in Vancouver's Chinatown that borders Hogan's Alley. And our vision is that we all work towards, the vision that we have is that for all people should have the means to make and access culture. These are all of our contributors who played a major part in providing the information for the publication and working with us to kind of come up with these ideas over the past 2 years. So we worked with groups of artists, we worked with groups of principal researchers in other fields such as information sciences and geographies and systems engineering. We worked with designers to come up with the design identity and to think through the implications of designing systems with blockchain. We worked with a series of advisors, big shout out to them for lending their advice and their networks to help us learn and enter this space. And we have a series of partners as well who we co-programmed events with and co-learned with throughout the past 2 years. So thank you to everyone involved here. You were a tremendous, incredible part of this. And I think that your intellect, your challenges, and your generosity kind of all brought us to where we are today. I'm just going to kind of open up. And so the fulcrum kind of our project and what we're looking at kind of rests on these kind of ideas. You know, what we're looking at is an image of Glenn Lewis's public sculpture, Classical Toy Boat. And then I encountered it in 2019 on a pretty warm spring day, the warmest spring day to date for that year in 2019. But the pond was covered with algae and glowing with algae because the spring came on so quickly that it just kind of became this chartreuse kind of like green. And then over top of that image, I overlaid some ideas that come from Mario Lederman-Euclid's Manifesto for Maintenance Art. And so the crux of her Manifesto for Maintenance Art is looking at a form of practice that can maybe turn us away from the death instinct and towards the life instinct. And so the death instinct that Mario Lederman-Euclid says is it's separation, it's individuality, it's avant-garde par excellence. It's about following one's own path to death, do your own thing, dynamic change. And then the life instinct that she writes in this is the unification, the eternal return, the perpetuation and maintenance of the species, survival systems and operations, equilibrium. And Mario Lederman-Euclid, as you might know, as an artist who later in the 70s became the artist in residence of the New York Department of Sanitation. And one of her projects there was to shake every garbage person's hand and thank them for their work in keeping the city clean. Some other thoughts in more recent culture that lead us towards this strategy. You might have read Jenny Odell's book from 2019, How to Do Nothing, an artist and professor at Stanford. It was about resisting the attention economy, and that's kind of a social media economy. It's Amazon, it's everything that's cognitive and surveillance capitalism. But she says that capitalism, colonialist thinking, loneliness, and an abusive stance towards the environment all co-produce one another. And then another example in recent literature would be from Kim Stanley Robinson's The Ministry for the Future, a very detailed near future account of how we might be able to meet the challenges of climate change as a global society. But what I pasted on the right is the entirety of his chapter 43, which is a very short chapter, but it's dedicated to the potential of blockchain. He's not going to detail exactly how this works for you, but I think what he's doing is he's saying that here's a challenge, and I think there's great potential here, and I'd like like you to carry it forward. So you write the rest of the chapter 43. But just to end, he says, you don't know me, you don't understand me, and yet still if you want justice, I'll help you to find it. I am blockchain, I am encryption, I am code. Now put me to work. And then some of you might have joined us earlier or later in April for a talk with one of our fellows, Christina Battle, an artist in Edmonton, who was speaking with an urban geographer, Stephanie Wakefield, who's based in the Southeast US and was working a lot from Miami in the past couple of years. And Stephanie has come up and has been working through this lens of the back loop. And this became quite a central kind of lens for us to use in thinking through our strategy. And I'll talk more about where that came from with a workshop with new models later on. But essentially, to kind of understand Stephanie's kind of take is that the back loop is the phase of the ecosystem that we're experiencing right now. It's the phase of the ecosystem when it breaks down. So when the ecosystem breaks down, the stable actors, chemicals, agents, species start to mingle and meet new species, new chemicals, and new agents within their ecosystem. And essentially, out of those new meetings and those new connection points, the new ecosystem is born. And with that, there's kind of new chemistry and new relationships that are formed that rebuild the ecosystem into something else, something not like we've had before. And so Stephanie uses this lens to kind of go through periods of human history. So we can say that, you know, modernity and colonization are definitely the exploitation period down here in the lower left quadrant. And she says that that's a period of colonization, slavery, resource extraction, industrialization, proletarianization, and the combustion of fossil fuels. And then you're thrust into the Anthropocene front loop with that kind of extraction and exploitation. Then we reach the 20th century. We'll have periods of globalization and liberal capitalism and one world, very much the globalist view, the post-war view. We have the nature-human split, we have modern infrastructure, we have modern politics, and we have stable climates. And for the majority of probably my lifetime, we've been leaving that conservation period and we've been entering the back loop, and now we have reached the release phase. And I'd say that the climate has been changing. The seas are definitely rising. Confusion and fragmentation of modern codes is abounding. We're getting more comfortable with experimentation to kind of try and work our way out of this, or to stabilize or find some kind of dignity and humanity within these changes. And then I'd say the many things that we're using to work through it are kind of thoughts through resilience, acquiescence, and kind of as we enter this kind of post-truth period, or this pluriverse during this breakdown phase of our ecosystem. And that is both the physical world and the digital world, because they are inherently connected. So what I want to look at is kind of thinking through a digital strategy that is prepared for the challenges ahead of us. And, you know, this is a technology that's moving very quickly. In short, maybe I should just give a brief disclaimer about, or kind of descriptive about kind of blockchain, but essentially you probably have heard of it. It's connected to Bitcoin. It's the technology that underwrites the Bitcoin currency, but it's not its only use case. It's just its first and kind of largest use case. Since 2008, it's been used that way. But essentially, it's just a set of ledgers that are used to track and record transactions. And instead of thinking that there's a centralized true ledger that we all have to verify our ledgers against, essentially the idea is that the ledgers all verify each other and are updated simultaneously. So there is never a centralized ledger that you have to verify against. The idea is that there's many nodes spread throughout the world that all communicate at the same time, and that's how we keep track of value. Previously, yeah, we've had a digital economy since the 1990s, of course. I still remember giving a presentation to my parents on PowerPoint in the 1990s about why I should be allowed to use their credit card to buy things on the internet and off of eBay, which worked. And they still don't use their credit card online to buy anything, even throughout the pandemic. So they were not convinced, but at least I got access. But I think that kind of speaks to it there, is that there's certain kind of things where we had to port our digital economy through our physical and kind of legacy economy first. And so now we're entering a period where this economy is going to be kind of tied to the digital in a way that is much more reactive, much more agent, and people will not have to work through the kind of legacy economy to get to a digital economy. Of course, there'll still be room for the legacy economy to operate in this space, but what we're seeing is a new kind of economy built out from here. And so the strategy screen is really a set of criteria, it's a set of descriptions, it's a set of values that help guide us in our decision making. It's not going to lay out a strategic action that's going to take place over the next 10 years by the organization. But these are some of the tools that we go in with, thinking through about how to work with this technology as it advances. So we reject surveillance, and we want to advance self-sovereign digital identities as a way to build a better internet. So we think that that's a very crucial part of what blockchain can offer. Essentially, you know, all of our identities are registered as people, but I think and within our states, but I think there's things changing, and we're looking at ways that we can have digital identities that are trustable, that are unique to us, and that allow us to kind of have better access to how our data is trafficked and traded. And that's going to essentially get us to a better internet if we can look at use cases that center those. We want to interrogate utopian visions and solutionism while being mindful of heroic claims. So again, as part of that back loop lens, we're learning from kind of mistakes of the past, and we want to look at that kind of like tech optimism that comes through in any of these discussions and kind of give it a critical lens. At the same time, we're looking at building out a new economy. We want to kind of counter some of the stuff that the legacy economy has kind of left us with in terms of challenges and traumas and violences, but we want to counter the neoliberal expansionist paradigm through a new economy. And we don't want to fall into the trap that disruption is a form of innovation always. And we want to develop systems that steward socially and ecologically ergonomic design that reinforces anti-ableist, anti-racist, and indigenous positions. So as we move out of legacy forms of economies and infrastructures, we carry with us some of their ghosts and some of their ancestors. And these are the things that we need to start to kind of work on and work against if we're going to have any hope in making this new economy any more equitable than the one we're currently living with. Continuing on, we want to strive for simplicity on behalf of the usership, and we see the usership of networks that we are going to be involved with will include humans, they will include bots and other forms of artificial intelligence, and they can include other organic life forms such as bees or forests. We want to distribute political and economic power through an infrastructural mutualist framework. So looking at infrastructure as a mutualist pursuit in terms of production, in terms of service, and in terms of maintenance. You know, you get here by decentering Western ideology and applying a non-Western historical and ontological knowledge to the challenges you're facing. And this comes from reading philosophers like Akili Mbembe, who kind of diagnoses the Western mind as inherently kind of plagued as a paranoid thing these days from the traumas of the 20th century and colonialism. And so with that, you know, we need to kind of look at it as a traumatized form of knowledge, and we need to look at how we can heal it and start to bring other forms of knowledge to the table to help us move forward. And through that, we want to heal and unify social and cultural division. And we want to be able to contribute to new mass narratives that connect to the fundamentals of the ecology that we're living in and to the economies and the cultures that we're living with. I'm going to do a quick overview of our research papers that are in the publication that helped us kind of get to where we are through our thinking. Just on the right there's an image of Ron Tran's print on silk beneath the pleasant grass. It was a work that he made in collaboration with Julian Yizhong Hao, who is an artist we'll talk about, but part of Julian's research worked with a couple of other artists working on a portfolio of prints to help them come up with some ideas and some conversations, and that was an example of one of them. But we have Rosemary Heather, as we mentioned, who's joining us today, who's our editorial director, and then Julian, who's an artist based here in Vancouver and also in Vernon. We have Patricia Reed, who's a Canadian artist who lives in Berlin, and she's also a theorist and writer. And then we have Maral Sudahania, who's a critical geographer who's based in Victoria on Vancouver Island. She's currently finishing her PhD at the University of Victoria, and she's also working for the province of BC's Climate Action Secretariat on a blockchain-based carbon trading platform. So Rosemary can tell you more about this later on, but the staking internet is essentially a new protocol for kind of verifying trades on the blockchain. What we were working with previously coming out of Bitcoin was something called proof of work. It was incredibly time, energy, power kind of consumptive kind of computational protocol that verified all of these transactions. And what we're looking at potentially 6 months from now is a new protocol that's been in development for quite a long time and much anticipated called proof of stake. And Rosemary will tell us more about what that means. But essentially, it's a much lower volume kind of protocol. It uses less energy, it uses less time, and people are able to collaborate more quickly around it. So there's a lot going on there. It's on a totally different blockchain. It is on a different cryptocurrency known as Ethereum. Essentially why we're interested in this is that an internet with stakes has the potential to empower a global network of users better than the proof of work protocol. We have Julian Yizhong Hao, and then for his work, he looked at this idea that he's come up with called Animatic Tokenization, and it's based on anoesis, and that's a state of sensation without cognition. And it provides the conceptual basis for his ideas of animatic tokenization. And so what that means is that you'll be able to kind of connect to the fundamentals of your world better by just knowing or sensing what is good and what is healthy and what will kind of provide you with your next step in life, rather than kind of overthinking it through the many layers that we have to work through these days. And he thinks, this is going to give us more attentiveness to a bodily experience and going to help us tie more concretely to sensations from the material and immaterial world. And so through this system, Julian sees these tokens quantifying value of relationships, not things. And this has the potential to challenge hierarchical relationships typical of the legacy culture industry. Then we have Patricia Reed, who's written a paper called The Valuation of Necessity, and her paper comes paired with 12 diagrams. I believe there might be a few more, but the diagrams help illustrate some of the kind of complex ideas that she's working through in her paper. But Patricia takes us back a couple hundred of years where we go through kind of how we get stuck in these kind of thought loops or these kind of engagement loops with technology and culture that kind of keep us in these constraints. And so what she's trying to do is kind of unweave these constraints through layers of thought and through layers of technology over the past couple of centuries. What she arrives at is that the thing that we're dealing with right now, a climate disaster, massive global inequality, and these things are all further complicated and accelerated by a global pandemic, are not a necessity, but a historically based cultural construct. And that if we could recognize this as such, we could change it. And so she says the need for such an epimistic rupture could hardly be more urgent. And then our final paper is Moral Pseudogenia, Encrypting Enclosures. They scrutinize the value proposition claims from blockchain applications for real estate. And so Moral's taken her geography kind of lenses and turned them onto the blockchain technology and how real estate is now looking at this as a form of fractionalized ownership. And she also brings in some scholarship and literature around centralized platform real estate like Airbnb and how that's intensified the crisis of housing inaccessibility, and how we do not, and as an organization or as a group of people in the development community, we do not want to contribute to things that will further advance this crisis. So, could blockchain-based fractionalized ownerships remedy the problem as much as they might accelerate it? I think that depends how they're developed and who they're developed with. Moral finds telling details that undermine the broader claims that are made by the startups operating in this space today. I do want to give a shout out to one of our fifth researchers who we didn't include in the publication because their research focused actually on us at 221A, and we work with also about 150 subtenants across 4 facilities that we lease out studios to, and those are below market rate and on a cost recovery model. So we looked at that model with Erica Wong, who is a researcher in the UK but is from here in Vancouver, and so that information was very helpful to us in terms of navigating the pandemic, knowing what that economy was like, knowing what to prepare for and what challenges we were facing as a community as we entered this challenging moment. But we did not publish those findings as though those are kind of internal things, and we don't kind of share details about the people we work with in our studios at that level, out of protection of privacy and their own practices, and really centering them is the most important thing in those relationships. So thank you, Erica, for that study. And you can find out more about Erica's work on our website to kind of tell you a little bit about her abstract and how she approached that. And then we'll move into our partners that we worked with. So our partners were groups that we worked with to do public programming over the past 2 years. And we kept an open dialogue in many ways around the conversations we were having and the challenges and questions that were coming up in those programs that helped us come to some of our ideas in this strategy. And then just to the right, it's actually the color palette that our lead designer, Christy Neary, came up with for this digital strategy as we go forward. But our groups are Blockchain at UBC. We have New Models. We have Doma, which is a startup and a nonprofit. We have Chinook, which is a startup, Chinook X, which is a startup. And then we have BCoin, the BCoin Project, which is an interesting group and project coming out of Berlin. But Blockchain at UBC is Canada's largest multidisciplinary research cluster on blockchain at the University of British Columbia. And they work across disciplines, so information sciences, computer sciences, business, medicine, nursing, social work, all kinds of groups getting together to think about this common challenge, which is how do you develop equitably and kind of build civil society around the blockchain? They work on initiatives about digital identity, smart contracts, quantum safe systems. So as computers get faster and reach quantum level computing, we'll need different levels of security, and they're already thinking about that. Data sovereignty for indigenous sovereignty is something they're working on, and they introduce us to Chinook X group. And they also look at land management on the blockchain. They came up with the first training path for graduate students who contribute to scaling the blockchain industry while also tackling the world's most complex socio-technical issues. So there's students in master's programs and PhD programs kind of now working with the blockchain as their challenge. And I just want to give a shout out to them. They have an upcoming technology symposium in June from the 1st to the 4th, which is free, and it's on Zoom, so you can find out more at their website. Just give them a Google, Blockchain at UBC. We also work with New Models, which is an aggregator, podcast stream and Discord community based out of Berlin. It's led by the artist Daniel Keller, the writer and editor Caroline Busta, and the music video producer Little Internet. New Models is really interested in like a pro-complexity narrative. So they're looking at ecology, they're looking at politics, they're looking at tech, they're looking at activism, they're looking at design, they're looking at marketing. And so what we did with them is we did a workshop in conjunction with Blockchain at UBC in 2019. And it was offered in 2 spaces, one in our 22NA space in Chinatown and one out in the campus pre-COVID times. But what we learned from this is that the workshop was really focused on ideas of climate collapse, and that this is probably an inevitability more than kind of a fantasy at this point. And so if we want to look at the climate as a central kind of base code and something that we need to work with in terms of like our most urgent kind of coding challenge is kind of getting the ecosystem code right. The New Models kind of challenge us to move away from sustainability thinking and towards strategies of relinquishment and maintaining dignity and sovereignty within that shift. Through that workshop, we learned that hope and resilience narratives suppress the full truth, and that a collapsing climate is going to mean inevitable and untold loss. And within that, we need policy prescriptions that support us in psychologically preparing for this change and acknowledging the limits of production that humans have on the planet. And so actually thinking through the blockchain as like an academic challenge, as a cultural challenge, as a design challenge is something that is actually really helpful in psychologically preparing, because it's giving you options, and it's actually quite an interesting kind of fulcrum at a multidisciplinary table that allows people to kind of maybe leave some of their disciplinary trappings behind and start to think towards challenges and to think towards goals that we can start meeting in common, because this new technology enables kind of new forms of relationships and new forms of collaboration. Okay. Another one of our partners is Doma. And they're a nonprofit that's based between Kiev and Paris. And they're currently also one of our fellows working this year with 22NA throughout 2021. that came out of our work here. So they're taking us forward into the development phase of this project. But, you know, Doma, to start, is a platform cooperative. It's infrastructure for a new form of housing tenure. So people get together to achieve a common goal, which is sharing the value that is mass generated in a city. What they want to do is they want to enable the coordination of action at scale. The members of Doma would acquire shares and tokens of the Doma portfolio of properties. They would gain access to their properties for living, for recreation, for leisure, while they would build equity and become stakeholders at the same time. And so through this form of operating, what they want to do is they'll build another layer on top of the city that might be kind of better understood as kind of like a co-op of co-ops. And so what this does is it helps facilitates the emergence of new models for urban living, sharing, and organizing that fits the diversity of the urban condition. And so as the city population changes, as it meets new challenges, as it welcomes new people, as it says farewell to some other people, then the city becomes different, and the platform that's operating this is managed by the users themselves. So there is no centralized actor doing this. It is the city, and the governance of the city and its access to space is also up to the people who have built equity throughout the past couple of generations within it. Another one of our partners is Chinook X, and they're an indigenous group that works with data centers, and they want to link together a network of indigenous utilities, green energy, film and gaming industry partners. And so what they want to do is think through these sets of partnerships and then challenge these institutions with thinking through how can indigenous values and protocols be expressed through blockchain design. And so how does the value flow? How is the value aggregated? How is the value shared? There are some of the questions they're asking, and how does that meet indigenous values? Chinook X believes that indigenous nations have the jurisdictional authority and fortitude to accelerate and transform energy production. And they do this through smart grid and renewable energy distribution, meaning that there's a real-time supply and demand of energy within a region. So Chinook X is currently working predominantly in British Columbia right now, and hopefully they'll have some announcements later this year, as I know they were working on some funding agreements with the province of BC to help fund some of these first indigenous sovereign data centers. And then we have the BCoin Project, who are a partner of ours based in Berlin. And I have heard that they're actually going to be one of the projects that'll be included in the next Documenta and Documenta 15. So, one of their advisors comes out of this is from the Zentrum für Kunst und Urbanistics in Berlin, Matthias Einhoff, and they're one of the co-organizers of the Documenta that's coming up in 2015, or sorry, Documenta 15 in 2022. And so what BCoin is it's essentially a currency, a neighborhood currency that's established around the health of a set of beehives that are currently located inside the House of Statistics in Berlin, which is a very famous place, which is in East Berlin, which is where the East German regime would gather statistics on its populations. And of course, a very traumatized site loaded quite historically with the ghosts of communism's past. So as part of the regeneration of this facility, some of the space is being given to the BCoin Project. And so essentially there's sensors inside the beehives, and the bees are measured in terms of their health by measuring their temperature, by measuring different chemical substances inside the hive, and that lets us know how healthy the hive is. So essentially what you're able to do is create, it's an experiment in recoding the community as an existing decentralized organization. So decentralization is already a form of organization that exists in our communities. And so what we're looking at are there platforms that we can use to then code that decentralization as it's actually operating now. And so if you were able to contribute to keeping those beehives healthy, maybe you were planting more flowers, maybe you were providing indigenous species to the region that kind of help those bees survive, maybe you were taking out invasive species, these sorts of things, then maybe you can then be remunerated or kind of shared value for helping the health of the beehives be safeguarded. So this is a really interesting look. It's a decentralized autonomous organization, essentially. And it's also encouraging people to think about self-governance, but with non-human stakeholders involved. So the bees are just as much a part of this system as the people kind of maintaining it and then maintaining the habitats outside of it to keep the bees healthy. And so they're an active player and an agent, and they're given agency within this, and the coding is programmed around them. I'll just note that this project was preceded by a project called Terra Zero, which aimed to create a self-owned forest, which was developed by Paul Seidler and Max Hampshire, who created the coding base for the guild around bee care. And then I'll move on. So we have a couple of key performance targets. We're working in 2 phases, so near and long term over the next decade. So looking ahead to 2025, these are the kind of horizons that we're setting for ourselves. The strategy screen can be think of kind of like maybe like a sieve, and do opportunities kind of fit through it? And then yes, once they do, what are we going to kind of use those opportunities to work towards? But we want to build an equitable mix of funding between private, self-generated, and public revenues. We said that self-generated revenues should be applied to the advancement of our digital strategy and the organization's pursuits at large. Our education programs want to onboard and prioritize access and a diversity of engagement with our networks. And with that in mind, we keep simplicity of outcomes in sight for our users. So this might sound quite large right now, but as we get closer to developing kind of applications or networks that you can take part in, the outcomes of those networks the simplicity of them kind of will be kept in sight as kind of like an incentive to join. We want to look at partnering with 3 to 5 peer learning institutions who are co-developing this technology. And what's important for us is we want to co-develop this tech with communities who are non-white, non-tech, and non-university. And on top of that, we want to look at narrative partnerships within different sectors. So not just culture. We want to be looking outside of that, because this technology is going to take many sectors and many parts of society to kind of advance. And so we want to do storytelling, and we want to do kind of artistic works that help us look at the potentials behind this technology and help us better understand it. Maybe not in a coding way, but maybe more in a relationship-based way. We want to look at engagement and learning across continental scale digital stacks. And what does that mean? That means that, you know, as we're going forward in time, the world is becoming actually less and less connected. Maybe within certain regions, we're becoming more and more hyper-connected, but then within the larger regions, maybe we're becoming more disconnected. And so like that, we could see that there's a digital stack that exists between North America and Europe that's pretty easy to access and move between. However, if you wanted to go between Western Europe and Russia, it's more complicated, and your data kind of has to port between different platforms. And likewise, if you were going to try to port your data within the Chinese stack, which has now also become the African stack, because a lot of the physical infrastructure for the digital has been developed by China within Africa. And so this geopolitics, this older geopolitics continues with us into the future. As much as we would like to leave it behind, it's not staying behind, and we have to be cognizant of that. As we are developing this technology, and we want to find ways for it to kind of speak across those digital stacks. We want to engage users and audiences within user-directed and algorithm-directed social spaces online. And so that's also getting comfortable with the idea that the mainstream platforms that we use, like Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, maybe these are things that are more algorithm-directed, and we might look at them more like the mall. You could go there to get something that you need. You could get your nutrition. You could get a pair of jeans. You could see your grandparents. You could see your friends, but it might not be the space that allows you to develop a future that's very materially just for you and your community forward. So with that, there's also user-directed spaces that are filling online right now as we're looking to build a better internet. This community is growing around the world, but you can just think of the chat groups you have. You can think about the Telegram groups. You can think about the Discord servers that you're part of. These are all user-directed kind of digital spaces still. And so we need to come up with strategies that can engage between the two worlds. Looking ahead further on towards the end of this decade, we want to see that our digital strategy is helping to bring human and ecological equity in the digital realm. We want to see that our digital strategy is decentering Western ideology and allowing for a diversity of design, a diversity of development communities, and a diversity of users to take part. We want to look at equity as it's advanced through the platform development community. Specifically, the platform co-op development community is what we're interested in working with. And we want to see platforms that have wide scope benefit. Whereas you might want to think about a platform like Facebook or like Airbnb as a centralized platform that extracts value from around the world and deposits it in people's bank accounts. And those people might live in California, but their bank accounts might be all over. But we kind of see that extraction kind of going in one direction. So what we want to see are cooperative platforms that start to kind of recognize and generate value, and then look at distributing it in much more integrated ways. And we want a strategy that responds to value as valuation changes across cultures. So over the next decade, we can see that the way that value is generated and recognized in our culture is going to change. And that could lean towards bioregionalism, so that maybe it's not so much about states, nation states, and within that kind of provinces and smaller states of kind of zones of economic activity, but we look at them more as bioregions. So maybe the Pacific Northwest coast is more understood as an integrated bioregion, and that is then kind of mirrored within industrial culture and digital culture at the same time, in the way that value is generated and distributed and then traded outside of that region. And then we also look towards reparation as a cultural shift over the next decade, and how can the blockchain be used to start bringing cultural reparation and economic and equitable reparation towards kind of people and communities who've been traumatized by colonialism and modernism over the past several generations. We want to look at ways that our digital strategy can distribute political and economic power. And that's done by growing our networks with mass collaboration. And that gives us a governance that is empowered to respond to coordinated inauthentic behavior. So as we see kind of groups of misinformation kind of leading anti-vaxxers or kind of racist politics right now, what we're looking at is that's coordinated inauthentic behavior on networks, and it's behavior that networks do not want to tolerate anymore. So how do we design governance models around these that allow us to then have better agency to respond to this as coordinated activity? Because as we've seen throughout the political period since 2016 and then the pandemic, is that we do not currently have any tools in place to kind of respond to this inauthentic behavior within our networks and within our society. We want to onboard users excluded by traditional financial barriers and other traditional criteria for political action and citizenship. So we do see the blockchain as being able to provide people who've been excluded from the state and excluded from traditional finance from having a stake and having participation within these networks. And that is the way that the state shifts its services, as well as finance is then shifted and distributed on the blockchain. And finally, we'd like to promote mutualist and cooperative goals as the ideals kind of the networks that we're going to develop and contribute towards with our digital strategy. In closing, I just want to give a view forward into a couple of events later in June that will continue these conversations around our digital strategy launch. So each event will be taking place Friday mornings at 10 a.m. Pacific time, 1 in the afternoon Eastern time, and 7 Central European Summer Time in the evening. So coming up on Friday, June 4th, we'll have a discussion around Patricia Reed's paper in our publication, The Valuation of Necessity, and that will also include Rosemary Heather, Maral Sudehenia, another researcher on the project, and Patricia's invited another researcher who she knows in Berlin, Wasim El-Sindi of Zero X Salon, who writes and thinks about the blockchain and its ecological and social impacts at scale. So we'll talk through her paper and how to get us out of these kind of cultural knots that we're stuck in as we think through what this technology could be used for over the next decade and beyond. On Friday, June 18th, we're going to be doing a discussion centered around the work of Doma, our current fellow, the nonprofit housing cooperative. And they will be joined by Maral Sudehenia again, our geographer and researcher, as well as Andy Yan, who's the director of Simon Fraser University's City program. And he's been integral in kind of studying the housing crisis here in Vancouver. And he's looking at new data on the informal and secondary market for rental accommodations in our city, which is very important to speak about as we think about these platforms. And we'll also be joined by Ian Spangler, who is a geographer and PhD student at the University of Kentucky, who's been writing about platform real estate from Airbnb to now with a very critical lens. And then finally, our final act for the series, it won't be a live stream, but we will release it on Friday, June 25th. Please sign up to our newsletter. I'll paste a link in our chat for you to sign up to the newsletter to receive this event. But it'll be a pre-recorded and edited event that's a roundtable where we're going to talk about some of the development teams who are doing some really interesting work with the blockchain right now and cultural projects. And they're developing things that are called social tokens. So these are forms of cryptocurrency that are developed around forms of socialization and groups working towards common goals online right now, as well as groups who are establishing things called distributed autonomous organizations. And these are self-governing groups that kind of, you could think of it more as like maybe like a internet of organizations, or kind of like a Reddit group, a Reddit subgroup, or a Discord server with a treasury, a governance system, and a shared bank account, who are able to actively kind of participate in the world and kind of produce projects and intervene in civil society in various ways. And so at that table, we'll have new models joining us, speaking about their protocol they're working on called Channel. We'll be joined by a brilliant writer who's thinking about this coming internet, or the third wave, the internet of value, Albiverse. We'll have Say DAO, which is an interesting governance and kind of voting protocol for these communities that's coming forward between a group and between developers here in Vancouver and in Berlin. We'll have Folia, which is kind of a digital gallery based or a digital kind of artwork kind of based platform that's doing some interesting work in this development space. We'll work with Trust, which is a co-working and design space in Berlin. We're also developing a DAO right now, which is quite interesting as a kind of an alternative art and design world. We'll speak to the artist Neil Balufa and his production company Bad Manners in Paris, who are looking at different microfinancing and crowdsourcing kind of mechanisms and community building mechanisms around their digital kind of storytelling projects, which are quite interesting. We'll have Circles, which is kind of a protocol for universal basic income on the blockchain, which is quite interesting. We're going to hear from a Canadian artist named Sarah Friend, who's living in Berlin, who's developing that. And then we'll also have Rosemary Heather, our editorial director. So again, that'll be released on the 25th. And you'll get an email from us if you're on our newsletter, alerting you to that. We're going to try and edit it down to something that's hopefully compelling to new users, and to welcome you into the space, and to give you a bit of foothold on kind of maybe where you can go with this technology now. So with that, I'll pass the Zoom window over to Rosemary Heather. She'll tell us a little bit about the staking internet, and then we'll have a conversation all together with Svitlana before opening it up to a wider conversation with you all in the audience.
Thank you, Jesse. That was great. How could you put it on the slide, where the staking internet slide? I don't know, because I'm not sure I have access to that. Yeah, so thanks, Jesse, for that overview. It shows the breadth of this project, many big ideas, and many diverse projects, and I think the common denominator is networks and self-organizing communities. So this is something that already exists on a very, very broad scale, and that's called Web 2, which is the Facebook, etc. There are all kinds of daily activities that happen on the web in communities that have self-organized together, courtesy of these platforms. But there's lots of problems with that, which everybody's familiar with. And those problems are connected to the business model of the Web 2, which is that more clicks equals more money. So people like Mark Zuckerberg doesn't care how he gets the clicks, and in fact he actively encourages all manner of conspiracy theory, etc. to thrive, because it brings traffic to the platform. It makes the platform a really huge, viable 2.2+ billion daily active user platform. And the other big platforms that operate according to similar economic models. So with the Blockchains and Cultural Padlocks project, what we're doing is building a narrative of Web3, of the next web, that is underpinned by blockchains, and looking at do blockchains have the solution to some of these problems. And I don't think this Web3 narrative is that well known, but it's been accelerated by the pandemic. So yeah, popular awareness of this whole crypto space has really broadened. NFTs are the latest thing that really got people's attention, because this artwork by Beeple, it was like the third highest price paid, I think, for any artwork. And that's ridiculous by any standards. It just doesn't really make any sense, especially because it appeared to be like a JPEG. So that's sort of another conversation, but it is these big kind of news items, these real outliers that do get popular attention and get people interested. And there will be more, like, I think NFTs have much broader use than just as a form of art, internet art, and that will be rolling out, you know, as we move forward. So my focus, my research is on staking as an integral part of Web3, and there's this explanation here. Also, just sort of run it down. To me, this is just a simple story, staking, of taking your router and making it earn some passive income for you. That's kind of in broad strokes what staking is. So on the Web3, the router helps manage the internet. So it's another node on the network in exchange for dividends. This is an important point of Web3, is that the more nodes there are on the network, the more secure the data it manages is. And the reason for that is that the data is replicated across the network, and it's also reconciled at regular intervals, and it makes it very secure. It makes it so secure you can have money, and the money is proved to be, yeah, it's generated billions of dollars of value. So the idea of staking, which is this new internet protocol that is proposed as a solution to first generation blockchain protocol, which is called proof of work, which, as this is another popular narrative that's really gained traction. Basically, all the nodes on the network, or the miners, excuse me, which is sort of a misnomer because they're not really miners, but it's just these banks of computers competing to solve very complex problems. And if you win a block of Bitcoin or another crypto. But the problem is that this is massively energy intensive. It's not as energy intensive as, there's many arguments to sort of contrast this popular narrative about other things that are much more energy intensive, like the US military, for instance, and the dollar that's connected to that. The US has its dominance globally because of the oil is dominated in US dollars, and all kinds of geopolitical ramifications just play out from that fact. The US military is the biggest user of oil in the world. So, and there is this argument that blockchains, because it does have this energy problem, it incentivizes green energy solutions because miners want to earn profits, and if all their they don't want their profits eaten up by energy costs, so they do things like they do use green energy solutions, and that's constantly being developed. But proof of stake also proposes a solution to this, because that's where staking comes from. You deposit your coins, you buy some coins, deposit them, and then you earn revenue in exchange for your node helping to manage the network and make it more secure, by adding to the number of nodes that there are on the network. So there's problems with this narrative. That's a very popular narrative or it's like a foundational narrative in the crypto world about decentralization, why that's important. The truth is something, it's less pure than that, because in a lot of ways, the current blockchains are not decentralized. They're miners who are really dominant, for instance. In other ways, they're so-called whales. They own them so much crypto they can move the market. This whole narrative about Elon Musk moving the market, I mean, he did have some effect by his sort of antics, but whales have much bigger possibility to move the market because they own so much crypto. So these are all problems that are just a little bit different than the narrative, but the narrative itself is interesting, and what that interests me is that it takes already established behavior, but it gives users more benefit to their daily internet use, and by that I mean it means that I earn some passive income, and instead of my internet activity making Mark Zuckerberg rich, and he doesn't need to be any richer than he already is. So this is a solution that appeals to me. It's like a simple step to onboarding people into this new Web3 ecosystem. Yeah, and as I said, it's just an extension of what we do every day when we make content for the web. You know, and that's very popular. It's not going away, these online communities. Yeah, and so we're also building this narrative of mass collaboration, of the internet being a tool of mass collaboration, and that's not a way that I typically see the internet talked about, and I'm not sure why, because it seems kind of obvious to me. But maybe the reason is that this mass collaboration is going through these centralized proprietary entities like Facebook, and the Web3 brings the potential for this mass collaboration to be peer-to-peer. That's what the whole blockchain thing, blockchain technology enables, is that I can send an NFT or I can send cryptocurrency to another user or to another platform, to an exchange, without it going through any kind of central entity. And the huge industry has popped up, like massive global industries popped up to try and understand the implications of this. Yeah, and yeah, the global industry moves very quickly. And I've been researching this space for a while, and it does take me some effort to keep up with what's going on. And that's actually a kind of an effect of this peer-to-peer and open source yeah, circumstances on which the Web3 is being built and it has properties of an emergent entity, which is what a lot of what's already happened on the web also is that, where just the parts are much bigger than, or the whole is much bigger than the parts. That's the definition of the entity, or no, it's actually the parts working together make something that's entirely new, like another level entity. That's what an emergent entity is. That's what the web is, and Web3 is at another level. And I guess, as people know in the popular narrative, there's lots of highs and lows to that. Everything's quite volatile. There are big hacks, stuff like that. And if you sort of are involved in the space, you kind of become subject to these kind of events where everything falls apart. Sort of part of the price of admission. Like, for instance, I have only a small amount of cryptocurrency because I never was very, I don't know, just never really took it that seriously. And so if I got paid a couple times in Bitcoin, I would just sell it. But I have a little bit of crypto in a cold wallet, so it keeps it offline. And then all the users got their information dumped on the open internet. That happened last fall. That was very disconcerting, but that was, I changed a lot of my internet presence as a result of that hack. But yeah, I see it as kind of, it's a very experimental space, and you are subject to these kind of very eventful things happening. So the staking internet is the paper I wrote kind of addresses the steep learning curve just by starting with staking. And it's just a simple thing where if you get a wallet, which you can have on your phone, you have a bit of crypto, you could stake that and earn some passive income. And I think that's a good way to start onboarding into the crypto ecosystem as a whole. And there are also staking pools, which actually is probably more the reality for most people who don't have huge amounts of crypto, like myself, is that you would deposit your crypto in a staking pool. And that's what we're exploring as a next step at 221A, is we want to look at what, if this is possible for nonprofits. We want to research what the legal, the fiduciary, other implications are of having a nonprofit be involved in a staking pool. And we don't know the answers yet, but I would say that, like, the legacy finance industry understands what the potential staking. There's a project in Toronto called tokens.com, and that's a legacy finance project. They raised $25 million recently to just stake their clients' money. And this is a private offering, so that means me, because I don't have $1 million, I can't join that. I can't buy shares in tokens.com. So I find that annoying. That this is how legacy finance operates: is that small players are kept out of the system. So that's one reason why I'm interested in crypto. So I'll just close off by saying, as I mentioned before, the big ideas I mentioned, like decentralization, it's a lot more complicated in reality. And I think that leads into some of the questions Svitlana has that we can maybe talk about in more detail. So yeah, thanks.
Okay, I guess this is my turn, and I want to thank Rosemary for their presentations, and I also would like to thank the whole team of 221A for inviting me to join this event in this conversation. So I also want to congratulate you on the publication of this fantastic report, which is quite an achievement, this collective research undertaken by artists, curators, activists, designers, and interpreters, which actually shows this multidisciplinary kind of like approach and take on this topic, which is so important. What is especially important and interesting to me is that this investigative initiative has been undertaken with the help of a variety of projects of different nature, some exploring the technological application of blockchain, others subverting and challenging. Each of them has offered a lens, and the lens onto this technology. And as I ask some questions, as we discuss some ideas and notions related to blockchain, I actually want to invite both Rosemary and Jesse to refer to these projects if you see it's a helpful way to kind of like to refer to these projects as lenses to kind of like think through certain notions, certain ideas. So I really appreciate, and I always say it, I really appreciate what research-based art gives us, but even more so, I appreciate what art-based research could give. And I think this investigative report actually combines the best of both research-based art and art-based research. All right, so in the following 20 minutes or so, I'd like to organize, or I propose to organize this conversation about at least two topics, and they are infrastructure and ideology. So we'll see if we have enough time and how far we can go with ideology, but at least infrastructure, I think, is an important notion here. And it's specifically kind of like important immediately because I consider myself as a critical infrastructure scholar. So I see blockchain within this framework. All right, so I'll just want to read a couple of things, a couple of pieces that I prepared. And then I want to invite Rosemary and Jesse to respond to them. And probably in our Q&A, everyone else, if you see them engaging, also it would be nice to hear some kind of your resonances. So I would like to begin by mentioning something that we heard already in Jesse's presentation, but I'd like to again to reiterate one important point. And it is the following, that in the mind of many, blockchain is firmly connected to Bitcoin, and they are often understood as one, which of course they are not. Bitcoin is a cryptocurrency system that disdain the central authority for issuing currency, transferring ownership, and confirming transactions. Blockchain is its distributed database, a peer-to-peer network that was introduced back in 2008, just when Bitcoin was introduced, as part of a proposal for Bitcoin. Bitcoin is powered by blockchain, and it has been the first application of blockchain technology. In this sense, blockchain is Bitcoin's infrastructure. Today, we often hear that Bitcoin is obsolete. We also hear critical concerns about the ethics and politics of this technology, like in this question from yesterday's Twitter from Meredith Whittaker faculty director of the AI Now Institute, and she wrote, "Is now the time we collectively acknowledge that Bitcoin is a scam? What else are we waiting for?" End quote. If Bitcoin is vanishing from the technological landscape, blockchain thrives, and it has already found many users outside of Bitcoin. In this, blockchain again reveals itself as infrastructure, one of the key features of which is permanency, its lasting nature, regardless of what it can support initially and the purpose for which it was designed. And we can think of many examples of exactly kind of like the same logic. In the essay written back in 1999, The Ethnography of Infrastructure, which was foundational for infrastructure studies, and it was written by Susan Lee Starr, she listed the defining properties of the infrastructure, and she names embeddedness among them. And in fact, it names it first as one of the most important features, embeddedness. It means that infrastructure sinks into and inside other structures, social arrangements, and technologies. And it happens in a so subtle way that it might be hard to distinguish between separate elements of its complex architecture. And by its, I mean the infrastructural complex architecture. Overlooking their embeddedness, we tend to see some technologies as transgressive, disruptive, or revolutionary. But what media archaeology teaches us is that the revolutionary nature of technologies should be understood in terms of its original, astronomical meaning of the word revolution, which is a circular rotation of heavenly bodies. And in our context, it means the return of the same. The revolution is a rotation, return, coming back. To complicate this idea, in the most recent essay from a newly published collection with a telling title, "Your Computer is on Fire," another theorist of infrastructure, Paul Edwards, distinguishes between different temporalities within an infrastructural assemblage. He introduces the notion of second-order infrastructures. And he uses this notion to describe the infrastructural position of software platforms. Specifically, he thinks of like all different platforms, from Facebook to apps, as new and relatively quick to build pieces of infrastructures layered on the top of older, slow to build, more capital intensive infrastructures, which shows to us that the whole thing that we think of an infrastructure is kind of like has different temporalities embedded in it. It has its own complexities. So some things are more visible to us. Other things are less transparent. Some of things kind of draw our attention immediately, especially if they're quote unquote new. And other things kind of tend to be on the background. However, all of them constitute this complexity of the infrastructural assemblage. And he writes, I quote, "Higher level applications are built on the top of lower level software such as networking, data transport, and operating system. Each level of the stack requires the capability of those below it, yet each appears to its programmers as an independent, self-contained system. So, infrastructure accommodates various temporalities within its layered structure. And nearly any definition of blockchain tells us that blockchain sits on the top of the internet. If the internet, and this is my question for discussion, is blockchain's direct foundation, do you see it useful, and if so, how and why, to describe blockchain as a second-order infrastructure set within the network of networks, which is a name we usually kind of used to refer to the internet, rather than opposing blockchain to the internet as entirely different technology. So maybe we are at the stage of rethinking this relation of blockchain to the internet, right? Its place within a complex infrastructural assemblage. If the internet is blockchain's material past, all the legacies it carries, and today we, in the media studies, we are naming many of them, right? We can speak about exploitative relations of production. We can think of Cold War militarism, and Rosemary also mentions some of its history in her essay. Of course, we can also think about imperial and colonial pasts as certain layers materialized in some infrastructural arrangements, right? That were also included in this very complex assemblage of the internet infrastructure. So in this case, all of this is that legacy that blockchain also inherits. And I think it would be an interesting question to think about, maybe with the help of these projects that I included that are part of your very interesting investigative project, if any of them allow us to see or reveal any kind of these legacies embedded in this infrastructural past, inscribed in what blockchain seems to be when it sits on the top of the internet. So I invite you to kind of like podcast a bit now. We'll see how much time we left. So there is enough topic on ideology, but we'll see when and how we'll go to it. Yeah.
Great, thanks, Svitlana. That's a great question. And yeah, that's exactly why we kind of asked you to join us to think through these issues. But I think your research really does illustrate this too, that infrastructure is never a radical break. You can't just develop a brand new infrastructure and build out a whole new world with it. It's something that you bring your biases and you bring your challenges of the past with you into the future. And I agree with you that there's like, you know, I think this is why the top end of the cryptocurrency news spectrum is really weighted towards token value, towards major players connected to kind of white male figures like Elon Musk or Vitalik Buterin or Dogecoin and these sorts of things. So it's kind of like all of these things from the past that we're still wrestling with are still leading this conversation at a popular level into the future. So I think what we need to do is, like this is something our project has tried to do, is try to look beneath that mainstream narrative, which is fairly easy to port those those issues and challenges and bias from the past into the future. They maintain the headlines, they maintain the kind of narrative momentum. You know, I think the way that kind of the crypto space in the mainstream is developing right now is very much akin to the gold rush in some ways in North America. It's a form of kind of swarm colonialism. They're kind of seeing this space as digital land. They want to get as much kind of power and extract as much resources from it early on to be able to kind of then become a power player in the next phase. And so that's still very much a challenge that we're dealing with, but I don't think we have the option to completely ignore it either, but I don't think we have to behave completely like them at the same time. So I think, again, it's just being cognizant of those challenges and moving with it. You know, I think it's funny, one of the people who are joining us for our roundtable, Albiverse, you know, there was a crypto dip in the past week. I think like there was some pretty crazy valuations going on since earlier this winter. And then finally about a 40% dip hit the market. I'm not sure if that's the right number. Maybe Rosemary can update us. But yeah, there was a big dip this last week, but Albiverse, who's in our DAO roundtable later in June, kind of tweeted out, hey, isn't it nice to feel the crowded room emptying out and feeling full of fresh air all of a sudden? And so I think that these moments, they ebb and flow. Yeah, I think we have our work cut out for us to try and think through which things we take forward with us and maybe which things we leave behind. But again, I would just go back to using something like Stephanie Wakefield's lens of being in the back loop and thinking through like, yeah, I still need to have a firm foot to step forward. But at the same time, maybe we can acquiesce and leave behind the things that are weighing us down and not letting me take as much of a step as I'd like to with the footing and with the energy I'm able to gain from this moment. Rosemary, you're still muted on my end. That's weird.
Hi, is that better? Okay. Thank you, Jesse and Svitlana, and yeah, I think that's what we're trying to do is think through, add a counterbalance to a lot of the main narratives about blockchain that have been developed from its early years by, yeah, bringing in kind of humanistic thought. And to answer your question, Svitlana, like this idea, is the blockchain a separate technology, or is it just another layer on this network of networks? I think that some people associated with the early days of blockchain would like to think of it that way. And I think there have been efforts to create software that allows everybody to be their own kind of like, what is it, JavaScript server or something, which is the JavaScript is the basis of the legacy internet. So this would be a way to cut out the legacy internet altogether, is to create a blockchain version of that. But that's sort of based in this libertarian ideology. And it's so funny that you talk about this idea of infrastructure that's not acknowledged, because that's libertarianism all over. It doesn't seem to acknowledge anything that enables, you know, daily life to function, because there's this narrative of being liberated from that, because you can be your own bank and you can be your own government, et cetera, et cetera. So it's kind of a simplistic narrative, and I think that other narratives are building that that have a little more subtlety to them. And to answer your question about artworks, it's funny because I know of a work that that shows all the network connections. Any visualization that was in the early 2000s. I remember that work that showed all the strands of connection in a network that visualized that. I can't remember what it's called, I'm afraid. But I find any of these visualizations useful. I'm not so sure that artworks, I mean, you would have artworks like Beeple, where you're having people making illustrations, and I have nothing against that. I think it's great when artists can make money from their art. So that's been very profitable for some people because of the NFTs. So there's that. And then I think in the art world, the other direction things are trending is more towards creating online communities that, self-organized online communities that are on a Discord. Jesse mentioned this, or a Telegram channel. So that is moving away from the big platforms like Facebook. Correct me if I'm wrong, Jesse, but those are the two tendencies, less than a kind of investigation of like infrastructure per se. Although that's always been a tendency in art, in modernism, to try and show the conditions of the representation. But yeah, maybe Jesse, you could pick up the.
Yeah, I mean, for me, an exhibition has always been just a still life of a network in a lot of ways. And it's for someone like me who reads an exhibition or reads like a cultural project, I'm just seeing who's involved, what ideas are involved, how they're reacting and communicating those ideas between each other. And so how I see some of these projects coming out, like the Discord server is a potential future for it. We're looking at something called Friends with Benefits, which is an interesting online community that was started by the music producer Trevor McFedries. That's an interesting community that's developing. It's having its own social token. It's having its own culture form. It's looking at financing its members' projects in certain ways. There is a threshold to get in with a cryptocurrency, but there's also other ways to get in, kind of like scholarships or kind of through social verification, or maybe what you can offer to the community, which is really interesting. So I think those kind of projects are really progressive forms of cultural practice with kind of within the blockchain space, within the crypto space. But within our project too, I mean, I think Julian Howe, even like the way that he's trying to deal with not just the internet as a legacy that he's trying to contend with, but also like a legacy of the art world, right? Like, so the legacy of the art world didn't really even meet the internet. And so it's going through a double growing spurt right now as it tries to kind of encounter blockchain. Like, yeah, you saw artwork online, but the experiencing artwork and trading artwork never really became like an online thing. It was still very much a legacy world kind of tradition. The power players who had the power in the 50s post-war probably still have the power now. It's not that long ago. And so his ideas around animatic tokenization are, one, dealing with the legacy problems of the way art exists, and then the way art got the internet wrong, and then how can you then kind of reset these kind of conditions for the community that you want to work with and develop, and not just get bogged down by them. So, I mean, I think there's still room to work with the legacy art world in some ways, but it just doesn't feel like it has the same gravity to it, or the same kind of weight to it, and maybe it never did. Maybe the framing around it just changed at this moment. So I think it's still a space of action, but I still see what's happening outside of it kind of way more interesting and way more progressive in terms of propelling this tech and resolving this tech's issues with the previous layer of tech that we are still kind of embattled with.
Yeah, I would just say that to the form of community tokens and social tokens and these online communities, maybe we can understand that form as an expression of these conditions, even an expression of this infrastructure that speaks to something of the modern condition. And often with these historical changes, art is where I'm most familiar with these legacies and evolutions of practices and styles, etc. And I'm always interested in the way it's not recognized. When the new form appears, it's not recognized by the legacy world as being valid or even being art. So but I don't know if you have anything to add, or I've got a question for Svitlana. You can add. Yeah, good.
Add actually to this as well, because I think here is another, again, like in this whole discussion of the infrastructure studies, there are so many ways to think infrastructure, and one of them is another quite interesting and important notion in our context, I think, which is infrastructural palimpsest, which implies that all the layers either on the top of another do affect other layers, or at least impact or kind of foster some reconfiguration, right? So with like the notion of infrastructural palimpsest, which maybe even in some cases indeed has to do with certain erasure of something previous, right? But the erasure is also a type of a record which we need to recognize as a negative record. And I think it's an important gesture here when we think about certain newness or certain impact or something like that, right? So, and in this case, you know, like whether you actually kind of, you know, belong to the group that really believes in the newness of certain technology, or others who do not believe in any newness, I think what this notion of the infrastructural palimpsest can actually join these two conversations and create some other room for thinking about this relation between these different components of the layers of the infrastructure. Right? So, okay, and from this, I don't know if we have much time left, but I probably would like to offer maybe just a simple question, not a simple question, but just one question in relation to ideology, right? Because it's so much already in conversation with this whole notion of infrastructure, right? Because all these views, all beliefs about certain histories and the relations really kind of, you know, have to do with some kind of general framework that helps you to produce certain vision of what this assemblage is, right? And if we take ideology in this classic kind of like understanding, right? So it would be something, some system of beliefs that kind of like puts the relation, like kind of like puts you in a certain relation with, you know, the thing that you're looking at, right? And usually this relation is imaginary, right? It very often forecloses something or helps you to make sense of something that is quite difficult to understand, right? And in this case, I mean, without a certain ideology, without a set of metaphors, we could have done nothing, right? With such a complexity as blockchain. So in this case, you know, like whatever you want to think, whatever your attitude, whether you like or don't like ideology, it's very much present and in a sense even useful for kind of like working with this technology, right? So, and ideology, of course, is a super broad framework and notion and etc. And so many different topics can come up when we talk about ideology, right? So we can address the narratives that circulate all over again. We can think about so many different things, but one of kind of like one of the things that maybe I want to mention in this discussion is this kind of like something that I find quite interesting, right? So those who are critical of blockchain, and you know, like many would say that we live in a sort of post-ideological world, because everything is kind of connected, with everything is hybrid, right? So that when you cannot really identify what kind of economic system you belong or something else, right? So, and here with blockchain, maybe I want to suggest, maybe provocatively, that maybe blockchain is a sort of symptomatic of this particular kind of, you know, state of things, in the sense that myself, I would actually agree with those critics of blockchain as being a certain materialization of maybe even right-wing ideology, right? So which is post-nation state, transgressing borders, no regulation, and stuff like that, right? which allows privacy, which allows the security for conducting such operations, etc., etc. But at the same time, it's always intriguing how much and how powerfully it also attracts also the left groups. And I wonder, what do you make of it, right? So why is it so? So what is your reading of this situation? What is blockchain?
Yeah, I was listening to a talk from Ben Cervini over the weekend, and he's from the Foundation of Public Code in Amsterdam. But he's also into critical infrastructure studies and was kind of looking at the way, like, the 20th century and early 21st century, you kind of, something's a technology for about 30 years. And then it's acculturation, and how it's used and how it's traded and trafficked through by people, then kind of calcifies it as a form of an infrastructure. So I think that's what we're looking at right now with blockchain, is that we're in that nascent kind of technology phase. It's maybe 10 years old. It's still very technical, the technology, even those kind of who are well-versed in understanding it and developing it still have regular issues in making it operate sometimes, but for the most part, it does operate. And so with that in mind, I think it's also a cultural moment. And for however much this is true kind of in the past couple of years, and especially throughout the pandemic, but it's also interesting to see this, not just blockchain that's doing this sort of thing, so that you have kind of far right actors, and maybe you have far left actors, and maybe they're having similar thoughts all of a sudden. And this is kind of a political condition that's been called horseshoeing. So essentially the political spectrum gets kind of arced, and the center is down here, but then the left and the right, usually we're in opposing poles, are now closer to themselves than they are to the center. So I think that's the situation that we're dealing with, in the way that we have seen you know, market economies develop in places in the former Soviet Union for the past 35 years or so, and how that has taken place. It's not been nice, it's not been equitable, it's not been easy, but the conditions have been bumpy throughout, and it's a constant renegotiation to figure out where you are. And I don't think that having these poles of far left and far right are going to help us out in climate change scenarios much either, because I think we're going to need to work with the borders and work with the legacy institutions to evolve them to deal with the challenges that they are. Because I think from the pandemic, we've seen things stagnate, and we've seen things fail, and we've seen the center try to hyper-normalize this failure. So I think, you know, living through the cognitive dissonance of the pandemic in the global West, and especially here in Vancouver, you live in a hyper-normalized state of failed public health. You live in a hyper-normalized state of a failed state, essentially, that can no longer function as its ideals function, but yet the business sector is operating as if those ideals still existed, but the population is kind of cut out from that operation. So yeah, I don't believe the technology is either or, and I think looking at someone like Patricia Reed's paper kind of gets us to this voice, and that if we are saying that blockchain is someone is saying blockchain is inherently right-wing, well, what do you mean by that, and what do you mean right now in terms of where that's at? Because I wouldn't call it that. I don't think it's being designed to, I mean, sure, it's being used to trade money sometimes, but that fiat money is also being used to finance far more right-wing behavior than crypto is, from what I know. And in the same way, the far left isn't using it that much as much as the far right. So I think it's a much different group of people who are developing this technology, who are looking at maybe like a post-left scenario in terms of where it could go. And I think what we're looking at is in a climate change scenario and in a post-pandemic scenario, we are looking for things that attach more to the fundamentals of the material world that we live in. And so I think that people who've been believing in the things that they thought the state was supposed to be providing in terms of services for the past 30 years have seen those services decline, and they will continue to decline. I don't see, especially in Canada, a huge ideological shift to change the state to provide services once again in the way that they promised to. So I think it's a group of people who are just working to try and reconnect our digital culture, and our economy to the fundamentals of what we're dealing with, and how to sustain ourselves as a population to be as healthy as possible, and to be as communicative and equitable kind of as possible, kind of within that space. So, yeah.
I'll just follow up on that. That's excellent answer, Jesse, and great question, Svitlana. And it kind of brings me back to a question for you, Svitlana, is just like, maybe speaking of these kind of legacy infrastructures, is this paradigm of left, right useful? Jesse mentioned this idea of a post-left. I mean, I know in Ontario, we have just the worst possible government during the pandemic, and they're very far right, and they epitomize this idea that you know, the modern conservative movement has no ideas except to try and attack and divide and conquer and use xenophobia, etc. So that's my question to you, is about, what about this whole construct of left and right? Maybe that's an infrastructure that needs to evolve.
And this is a really great point and a question, because I think we can also think of it with the help of the notion of infrastructure, or at least with the help of some of these frameworks that I introduced earlier. Because if we consider infrastructure as this long-lasting, complex thing, right? So in a sense, I would like to suggest that in a sense, it's kind of like it outlives certain ideologies, and maybe with all this, its complexity and different layers and objects and systems embedded in it, maybe ideology kind of concern all these elements rather than infrastructure in general. But in our reading how things work and where they are embedded and what they are related to and what they are connected to when they are mobilized, it's very interesting to engage, in fact, left and right, and see what kind of systems at what point we're conditioning, right? So they're impacting certain technologies, and of what ideologies these technologies became, again, a materialization. And in this sense, as I already mentioned in our conversation before the event, I think China is a very interesting example, right? If you think of it, right? So the system that still refers to itself as like some communist, right? So, but at the same time, it still participates in neoliberal economy, and in fact today becomes one of the most powerful players of this economy, right? But also, I don't know if you close in relation to this particular topic of our conversation, and I know if you encountered this wonderful, wonderful book, which is called Blockchain Chicken Farm. It's a fantastic book, and I don't want to retell much of what it speaks about, but I really encourage everyone to look at it. It's written by Xiaowei Wang, and it's her investigation in some kind of, local businesses in deep remote Chinese villages of some, healthy chicken production. And in order to prove to the world that these are chickens that are well fed and not really kind of like industrializing, etc. So blockchain technology is used to trace the heartbeat of these chickens. In fact, and when you think of this, it's quite fantastic and quite unbelievable, right? So, but what's most interesting that the writer discovered on her trip is that none of the workers of this firm really knows what blockchain is, right? And then I again think about transparency and capacity of certain technologies that so strongly participate already, inside situations, but still remain, unknown to the extent that, that puts some responsibility on us who conduct such investigations. How do we communicate this complexity, right? So how do we educate? How do we produce a message about the meaning and function of this technology for general public in order to, in fact, inform better solutions or things like that. Yeah. So, but anyway, so it's a fantastic case, in fact, of this rural Chinese economy, which is at the center of high-tech kind of like scenario, right? So somewhere in the center of economy, blockchain chicken farm.
Yeah, that's an interesting kind of challenge to it. But I think, I think that's an instance of what you're bringing forward as like legacy culture being translated into the blockchain. And so this isn't like I don't know, when I've been in China and I've gone out to restaurants and stuff, like you go to a restaurant and it's maybe dedicated to the duck. But for instance, at the end of the meal, I would get a card telling me about the farm where these ducks would grow up. And this was over a decade ago. So there was something, there was a certain class of people who had access to kind of organically grown meats or these sorts of things. And so I think this is just a way to kind of like code that into the future. The other question around like food security is like, this organic farming is probably going to be for a certain class of people, whereas the scope issues of feeding the 7 billion plus people we have in the future are going to be much more complicated. So than just kind of nice farms for chickens. It's going to be a much more processed, kind of nutritious future.
Regulate this access and therefore sustain certain classes.
Yeah.
In this particular case, right?
Yeah. Yeah, it can sustain it and give it verifiable kind of rights, and it can kind of like tell people in the world that this is our practice and this is how we stay true to it and we stay true to our values. And then you could trace that piece of meat back to kind of, its infants and its heartbeat, like you were saying, which is interesting. But yeah, I think it's interesting too, just in thinking through that in terms of like what's developing here, and maybe it's not so much like a right-wing, left-wing approach, but maybe it's more of this, as Zygmunt Bauman says, you're constantly on this pendulum that swings between freedom and security, and that's what people are looking for kind of as they're developing these networks and trying to find that balance of the two. But I think on that notion of balance, one of the artists that we work with, Daniel Keller, and I think he's quoting someone else, so I have to understand who he was quoting, but he was speaking a while ago on one of the podcasts they do with New Models, but kind of seeing this kind of like crypto economy or this crypto finance that's establishing itself as a counterbalance to neoliberal capital and Chinese Communist Party capital. So even though the Chinese Communist Party participates in the neoliberal economy, you can say that their economy is still very much separate. There is a form of participation in the general kind of global economy, but there is an exclusion at the same time, and it's about porting in and outside of the country. And so what he was saying, Daniel was saying, was that crypto is kind of developing as this counterbalance between neoliberal capital and Chinese Communist Party capital. And we might see this start to emerge kind of on the global scale within the next 5, 10, 15 years, as well as an economic counterpower.
Yeah, I would just add that, I mean, the whole GameStop thing that happened earlier this year is sort of an example of that, because you had the people collaborating, they're in a Reddit forum, deciding together on which stock to pump, and so this is mass collaboration, but it's also something that was looked upon aghast by the legacy finance, even though they have various forms of collusion that they use daily to keep themselves rich and etc. So yeah, I think that these narratives are emerging, that the tools are available to collaborate in a different way, and in a way that provides people with an alternative to that system.
Maybe we should just open it up now to questions to folks in the audience. So thanks for sticking with us to get through the strategy and our conversation with Svitlana. So if you have questions for us about what we've spoken about, or in general about the technology or kind of where the strategy is going, please use the Q&A window and ask them away. And we can bring you in with a live voice, or if you prefer to just type it out, then we can just read it from the screen as well. But maybe just a question for Svitlana too, as well, as someone who's studying communications and digital democracy. Where you're at now, what has been the field's kind of like understanding of this technology, and how are they engaging with it kind of critically, or how are they getting involved in the civil society around it to start to influence it in certain ways?
You're asking about blockchain in particular?
Yeah, how has it come up, or what are the attitudes that you've been kind of seeing kind of within your work, within your sectors?
I guess some of the things I already mentioned. So I do see this kind of like debate about the ideology of blockchain. This is a very kind of like powerful thing in the media studies, right? To understand what this technology really represents, what the narrative around it kind of like forecloses, right? So, and where it actually reinforces some practices and strategies that are not so obvious when we think about quote-unquote revolutionary natures as technology. So that is one of the major concerns, but also there are some others. There is also at the same time a lot of enthusiasm and a lot of kind of desire to experiment with this technology, quite similar to what your project also indicates, right? So thinking about all possible questions and possibilities that this technology has. So we are very much aligned here.
Yes, Svitlana, I liked when you were talking about the erasure being a kind of record, and yeah, the erasure within the palimpsest being a kind of record, and these are not typically thought of in the everyday life, but are there instances where, I mean, I guess people really think about infrastructure when it fails mostly, right? Yeah, I mean, I don't maybe have more to say about that.
Right? That's when it becomes visible. That's a kind of like the most typical assumption about infrastructure. So it's supposed to be opaque. It's supposed to be invisible. It only reveals itself at failing. Yeah.
Yeah, and I mean, yeah. Well, right now it's a theme in the U.S. because of Biden's infrastructure project. So, and they need to invest in infrastructure. They didn't invest in infrastructure, and then bridges collapsed, etc. So they had to do that. But yeah, that's an old narrative that got revived as a way to bring a New Deal to the States again.
Great, so I'm not seeing any immediate questions come through, so there's a lot to kind of grapple with the publication. It is weighty, and we want it to be that way because it's something that we're going to be working with and working through for the next 10 years. So please do give us an email if you have any questions that come up. You can reach us at hello@221a.ca, and we'd be happy to kind of have a conversation with you. Likewise, if this conversation and this strategy has sparked any ideas for use cases or partnerships or potential applications of blockchain for you in your work, get in touch and let us know. We're curious to learn about that and make as many partners as we can as we move forward. Just to say that, we're looking at this as an institutional technology. So how do we develop institutions and organizations out there that can just really better help you organize yourselves and organize your communities and move your resources around. With that in mind, we'll leave it there and hope that you can join us for some of the other events in June. Coming up again, the first one is on June 4th, Friday, with Patricia Reed. So again, go onto our website, 2218.ca, and you can find a link to that, and you'll be able to register there. Later on in the month, we'll have a talk around Doma's work on June 18th, and then we'll release the recording, an edited recording of our roundtable with a couple of groups developing DAOs and social tokens on January 25th. So please sign up to our newsletter and you'll get that video in your inbox when it comes out. So thank you so much, Svitlana and Rosemary, for joining us today to kind of debut the strategy. Thanks to the Canada Council for the Arts for their support of our digital strategy work, and to Digital Democracies Institute at Simon Fraser University, which is a quickly growing and very urgent institute. And we look forward to learning more about your work and working with you in the coming years.
Thank you very much, Jesse and Rosemary, and the team of 221A.
Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks, everyone. Yeah.
Ciao. Bye-bye.